Hello and welcome to the programme which brings together British commentators with foreign correspondents who write, blog and broadcast to audiences back home from the Dateline, London. On today's programme we'll try to puncture the propaganda of arms and the theatre of diplomacy. What lies behind the threatened conflict over Ukraine? The Minsk agreements, what are they? Could they be a way out of the crisis? And why for some have they the whiff of Munich about them? And how is China affecting the decisions being taken both by Vladimir Putin and Joe Biden? Joining us this week, Ned Temko, a former Moscow correspondent who writes for the Christian Science Monitor. Nabila Ramdani is a French-Algerian journalist and broadcaster. Vincent Nee is China Affairs correspondent with The Guardian, and he's here in the studio with me. Welcome to all of you. Good to have your company today on Dateline. Now, let's begin, if we may, Ned, with this question of what the sort of phony war stage we appear to be at the moment with Ukraine. The West appears to have been playing Russia in its own game in the last few weeks, propaganda strikes, some sabre rattling, mobilising troops from the United States and other parts of Europe, in a sense calling President Putin's bluff. Do you think he's bluffing?
One of the problems is I think the only person who knows the answer to that question is Vladimir Putin himself. And I think it's fairly clear that that is, at least in part, what this is about. And that is to say that President Putin wants Russia to be center stage again in world diplomacy. He wants the West's and Washington's eyes upon Moscow and the Kremlin. And that has self-evidently been happening to a greater extent than pretty much at any time since the collapse of the Soviet Union. As to whether this amassing of huge numbers of combat-ready troops does indeed mean there's an invasion afoot, the only thing that apparently is incontrovertible is that he has enough combat-ready troops to move pretty much at any moment if he so chooses.
Nabila, all NATO members are obliged to protect one another if any of the members are attacked. Ukraine is not a member. There is no obligation to defend it. Is there a sense that if President Putin isn't bluffing, European countries acknowledge that they really are powerless to stop him?
Well, Sean, in very simple terms, what lies behind this potential war is the encirclement of a sovereign nation by a massive military machine. And Russia is clearly on a war footing. And this is driven by intense nationalism within the Kremlin and indeed by plenty of Putin supporters across his vast country. Now, Putin is an imperialist who wants to expand Mother Russia. And at the moment, he feels that the West is conspiring against his country and that the Ukraine is at the center of this assault. And he would argue that offensive moves are all part, if you like, of the defense of his nation. And specifically, the Russians are furious that Ukraine, which is a former Soviet state, wants to join NATO, as this will give NATO a huge strategic advantage on the border of Russia. And if Ukraine does become a member of NATO, then Ukraine will suddenly become massively stronger militarily. And as you quite rightly said, the principle of collective responsibility is what effectively underpins NATO. And if a NATO-backed Ukraine is threatened by Russia, then that means that everybody is at war. And this means that all 30 NATO states, including the United Kingdom, will be going to war on the side of the Ukraine. But as we know, this is by no means a new geopolitical crisis, but one that has remained unresolved for far too long. Remember that Russia has already annexed the Crimean Peninsula in southern Ukraine back in 2014, claiming to respond to anti-Moscow agitation in Ukraine. And that was one of the biggest land grabs in Europe since World War II. And this has led to widespread condemnation from the West and, of course, sanctions. But since then, the Russians have also been stepping up their military presence in the regions at Ukraine's border, in particular since last year, after fighting escalated in the Donbass area of Ukraine.
Vincent, let me bring you in here because Nabila talked there about sovereignty and we've got two almost conflicting arguments here, haven't we? The NATO countries are talking about sovereignty and protecting the identity of Ukraine. Russia is talking about identity. As a reporter who covers China-Western relationships, some of this sounds actually quite familiar, this sense of a difference between what is sovereign and what is kind of historic identity.
Yeah, totally. We have seen all these disputes, not just in China or on things related to China, but also on the Korean Peninsula, for example. North and South Korean crisis is yet to be solved. And going back to what Nabila was talking about, there's a potential that the war is going to be breaking out, so dragging all sorts of member states into this war. But there's also a diplomacy going on in Munich Security Conference this week. But clearly, Putin is not interested in diplomacy in solving this crisis. Diplomacy is arguably the most desirable approach to solving this crisis. But in Munich Security Conference, Sergei Lavrov is not present this week. So we'll have to see, how this crisis is going to move forward and what can bring both sides together on the negotiating table.
Yeah, which everyone hopes for. We'll talk a bit about one diplomatic option. Ned, you've served in Moscow, you've served in Washington. You've got two presidents who you could argue are kind of Cold War warriors in terms of their long careers and experience. I mean, Biden has been knocking around in the foreign affairs circles in Washington for half a century. Putin has been in office for more than 20 years and was a KGB agent when the Soviet Union was in its pomp. I mean, are they fighting an old battle here, or are they genuinely trying to find new rules of engagement to coexist in the decades ahead?
I think there's a mix of the two. I mean, one way to begin is to add to what Nabila said, and that is that one issue, and that is the potential of Ukrainian membership in NATO. Putin knows is not going to happen anytime soon. It wasn't even on the agenda. I mean, the Ukrainians would like it and NATO is not going to rule it out. But it's not imminent. And what this is about for Putin, the part of which is kind of old Cold War era, is he's been quite explicit. He wants to reestablish a kind of Soviet era sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. So that's part of the old approach. And you're right, Biden is both instinctively Atlanticist. He feels very strongly that the United States and the West have to be together in answering threats such as the one on the border of Ukraine, whether Ukraine is a full member of NATO or not. What has changed is two things. One, and I think this will bear watching in the months ahead, is this explicit move by Putin and welcomed by President Xi in Beijing to seek a kind of rapprochement between Moscow and Beijing as a kind of joint counterweight to America and the West. And then on the Western side, which is something I don't think Putin quite anticipated, is that whatever the short-term gains of getting the attention of the world as a result of this troop buildup, the fact is that there has been a greater degree of Western unity in response, and a greater sense, particularly in NATO, which was a security alliance which has kind of lost its obvious kind of mission since the end of the Cold War, now very much seems to feel that it does have a mission again. And I'm not sure that's something that Putin anticipated.
No, it's hard to believe, isn't it? It was only a couple of years ago that Donald Trump was expressing the view that perhaps NATO had its day and that America's interest in Europe had its day too. I mean, Vincent, in terms of what Ned was talking about there, the kind of, it's an interesting weekend to be talking about this because, it's 50 years since Nixon went to China to kind of divide China and Russia and kind of stick two fingers up at Moscow and say, we're buddies with China. It's Putin now in Beijing, not Nixon or indeed Biden. Is there really a common area of interest here? And is China in a position to kind of insulate Russia if there is military conflict and the West imposes the sanctions that it's threatening to impose?
Well, certainly, sure. On the surface, both countries are getting closer and closer, right? On the eve of the opening ceremony of the Winter Olympics 2 weeks ago, President Putin and President Xi sat down together and expressed their willingness to stand shoulder to shoulder, and they released a long document saying the cooperation between the two countries is limitless. However, I think when it comes to actually backing Russia, if Russia being sanctioned by the international community, by the West, China will also have to weigh up very carefully. Trade between Russia and China last year was about $140 billion. But China's trade with the European Union last year was about 4 or 5 times higher. So China has much more to lose. And also, in the worst case scenario, if Russia, for example, is excluded from the US dollar-dominated SWIFT international payment system, then China will also suffer because much of the trade payment settlement between the two countries are also in US dollars. So China will have to, weigh this up very, very carefully. It is one thing to say something that is so nice to each other. It is quite another to behave in such a way that show you are real friends.
Yeah, and only this week Russia was saying, oh look, China may be our best friend, but Germany is our second best friend. It welcomed Olaf Scholz to Moscow a few days ago. That takes us to the diplomatic initiatives, and there are plenty of them. But there's a lot of talk of using the Minsk agreements, reviving the Minsk agreements that helped bring some kind of ceasefire in eastern Ukraine back in 2014. Gosh, it's 8 years ago now this frozen war has been taking place. It may turn into a hot war again. Ned, do you have much confidence in Minsk as a way out of this?
Short answer is no. One of the strengths of Minsk when it was conceived was that it had this wonderful facility for being understood differently by both the parties, and that is Ukraine, which just basically wanted to end the fighting, and the fighting never ended completely, but it effectively dialed down the fighting in the eastern portion of Ukraine. Whereas the Russians stressed the part of the accord, which has not yet been fully implemented, it basically would give a special status to these two self-styled breakaway, ethnically Russian republics in the eastern part of the Ukraine, and from the Ukrainian perspective, would be kind of a Trojan horse in the middle of the Ukrainian constitutional system. So both sides have an incentive to say, oh yeah, great idea, let's implement this. But each side sees this very, very differently.
It's interesting, Nabila, because we had Jean-Yves Drian, the French foreign minister, warning of the danger that Russia potentially posed to Europe. In a sense, an echo of the fears in the 1930s about Germany, that that perhaps some of the enthusiasm in countries like the United States and Britain for doing deals with dictators to prevent fighting comes at a price, but a price that is paid by smaller countries or weaker countries. I think Ben Wallace, the UK Defence Secretary, talked about the whiff of Munich in Minsk. Is that a widely held fear in continental Europe?
Well, to be perfectly honest, I'm not actually sure what Jean-Yves Le Drian, the French Foreign Ministry, was driving at, but it could certainly be said that Mr. Macron has the look of a Chamberlain about him as he scuttles between capital cities. He looked particularly weak and ineffective. His Moscow meeting with Mr. Putin, especially when that ridiculous great table was placed between the two leaders. And there has certainly always been a whiff of Munich around the Minsk agreement, especially so in the context of the Crimean annexation. We must forget that Russia actually got away with the annexation of Crimea, and the French position can certainly be described as wishy-washy and dare I say, appeasing, if not far too pro-Russia. Mr. Macron has even suggested that Ukraine becomes like Finland during the Cold War, which is to say strictly neutral between Russia and the West. Now, the Ukrainians would argue that they have every right to make their own foreign policy decisions. And I think that more generally, the problem with the response from NATO countries in relation to the Ukraine crisis overall is that most of the focus is on Putin and not on President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine. And perhaps a lot more attention should be paid to Zelensky's approach. I mean, he has been insisting for a long time that there might be indeed a diplomatic way out of this. And since December, his government has been focusing on the fine points of the Minsk ceasefire deal. It's, of course, not a preferred outcome for his government, but a possible solution to avoid war. I think that ultimately the basis for the negotiation is actually flawed, and many Ukrainians believe that fulfilling the Minsk Accords per se is a concession to Russian military aggression. Remember that Kiev was actually forced to sign them during earlier Russian military incursions during the stirring up the war in the east. And Zelensky has actually floated the possibility of Ukraine guaranteeing its security in ways other than ascending to NATO membership, which clearly the Russians would be very pleased with. But I don't think that it seems very likely.
Vincent, it's interesting, this, isn't it? This kind of pressure on countries to sort of, kind of see the bigger picture. You know, some of their big, powerful neighbours say, come on, sign. They said it to the Czechs. They lost the Sudetenland. Before they knew it, they'd lost their whole country. Clearly, Putin is not Hitler, and he doesn't want to occupy or invade or change the character of Western Europe, but he wants to control his part and his borders. Some people say it's the same with Beijing and Taiwan. And we've heard voices in Washington, haven't we, saying saying that pressure needs to be put on Taiwan. Let's have one country, two systems. Let's acknowledge that historically this is a Chinese island. It's only the accident of the last 80 or 90 years that means it's even an independent country. How serious is that challenge?
Well, this is certainly going to be very serious. It's going to be a very difficult puzzle to solve. You know, you talked about Nixon's visit to China on 21st of February 1972. You know, one of the biggest achievements for that visit was the signing of the Shanghai Communique, in which they talk about Taiwan. U.S. acknowledges there is only one China, but, you know, who defines who owns this China, there's a bit of ambiguity. So,
and really, that's not been resolved in the 50 years since.
Exactly. So you can argue, you know, the wise approach to this very difficult problem is to kick the can down the road again. But is it going to happen? I don't have an answer here, and I don't think anyone has an answer here. And also, in the time of great power competition, if this proposal comes from Washington, I'm sure Beijing will reject that because Beijing wouldn't like the external force to interfere into its domestic affairs. That is its principle.
And Taiwan, presumably, even if there were some politicians who were sympathetic to the idea longer term, will be looking at what's happening in Hong Kong right now and saying, actually, what value is there in international guarantee?
Yeah, although Hong Kong's situation is quite different from Taiwan. Hong Kong is a part of China. The British handed over to China in 1997. But, you know, how this is going to be solved, I don't think anyone has an answer here. And we'll have to see, you know, how history plays out again.
Is this, in the end, Ned, the price we have to pay as Western countries for deciding that we will not fight actually with our own troops for Ukraine or for countries in that similar situation? That in the end, that comes at a price. And that price is, you might not like the word appeasement, but you sometimes have to compromise. And you can call it lots of different names. But in the end, it's the reality. If you're not prepared to fight for something, then it becomes a question of what concessions you can extract.
Yeah, I think that's what the United States in particular is grappling with now. And I think the context we have to look to is the Iraq War, Afghanistan. There is a great fatigue on both sides of the aisle in the United States about the notion of putting large numbers of boots in the ground overseas or on nation building. What is fascinating and I think very important about where we are now is that an unintended consequence, quite possibly, of what Putin's doing is to focus American minds, and this is both the Republican and Democratic Party, and many of the allies in Western Europe. And Nabila is absolutely right. There's been a whiff of appeasement among some West European powers towards Ukraine for some time now. But there's a divide now, and with 100,000+ Russian troops on the border of Ukraine, for instance, you have Poland and Hungary, which on the one hand have ideological strains with Western Europe within the EU, but have no doubt and have just been reminded of where their security interests lie, who don't want the clock turned back to an idea where they will be, in essence, a part of a Russian sphere of influence. And ironically, the same seems true of some Scandinavian countries like Sweden and Finland that are not part of NATO, but have been drawing much closer to NATO as a result of things like this troop presence on the Ukrainian border.
Ned, Nabila, Vincent, thank you all very much for that fascinating discussion. Right, we've got a few minutes left, so each of you get the chance to determine what we should be talking about. And Nabila, do you want to kick off?
Sure. There's a story that came to my attention. It's a great foreign policy story. It's effectively France pulling out of Mali. And I have to say that France's withdrawal from Mali, withdrawing its French forces effectively from the country, and indeed allied Western nations pulling out as well, is an entirely predictable story, in my view. And it fits in with the American-led withdrawal from Afghanistan after what can only be described as a disastrous war which lasted 2 decades. Now, obviously the war in Mali was nothing like as long, but equally difficult to prosecute. And you effectively had conventional French forces fighting terrorist groups while also trying to maintain peace and democracy in a hugely unstable country. And as we have seen, trying to actually create a sense of security and peace using the latest military hardware simply doesn't work. And on the contrary, it causes a horrific loss of civilian lives and wide-scale destruction. And let's be blunt about it, it also leads the indigenous civilian population growing to despise what they see as invaders, and so increasing radicalism and indeed terrorism. And France has regularly been accused of adopting a colonial era stance effectively in countries such as Mali and indeed in the wider Sahel region. But having said that, Macron completely rejected the idea that France has failed in its mission in Mali. He has a presidential election to win in April, and of course, any admission of defeat would be out of the question.
Ned, what's your story that we should be focusing a bit more on?
I'm trying to be more upbeat given the context of the program. And I just draw attention to the Iran-Western nuclear talks, which were, everyone assumed, headed towards abject failure up until a few weeks ago. And these have been going on forever in Vienna. And of course, the context is that Donald Trump unilaterally pulled the Americans out of this 2015 deal when he was president. But in the last few days, both the Americans and the Iranians have, for the first time, said that actually great progress has been made. Now, it doesn't mean we'll get an agreement, but it's the first time that that seems within prospect. And if it happens, one of the interesting aspects is that it will have happened with the support of the Russians and the Chinese, who, despite all the geopolitical tension with the United States and the West, equally don't want Iran to get a nuclear weapon, it would appear. And one potential consequence is that though it's very good for Iran to be able to sell more oil, which is one of the things they want out of the deal, the end of sanctions, or some of them, that's also good for the world economy and potentially good for Western Europe at a time when gas supplies from Russia, due to the Ukraine crisis, are under threat.
Yeah, thank you very much. Vincent, finally, in a sense, another aspect of identity politics.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to talk about this 18-year-old sports personality called Eileen Gu. She was born in San Francisco to a Chinese mother and an American father. And for many years, she saw herself as a bridge between the two great powers, China and America. And now, as the great power competition starts to intensify, she's caught up in the middle. Her citizenship, because this Winter Olympics, she's competing for China. She's already won 3 medals for China. In America, people say she's a traitor because you are not competing for our enemy, China. And in China, there's suspicion over her loyalty, whether she identifies herself as Chinese or American.
Because she's either Eileen Gu or she's
Gu Aileen, yeah.
Eileen Gu Aileen.
Yeah, in Chinese. Yeah, I mean, I think, the reason why I picked this story is because, we are talking about today essentially about changing world order. These are not abstract matters. There will be individuals like Eileen Gu being caught up in the middle. And I think we should look out for stories like Eileen Gu's and explain this much, much more complex story.
Vincent, Ned, Nabila, thank you all very much. Fascinating half hour. Thanks very much. Thank you very much for your company. Dateline London back same time next week. Goodbye.